Hello, and welcome to the webinar. My name is Victoria Raschke, and I'll be acting as moderator for today's event entitled Motivational Interviewing, an Overview and Application in Outreach, a production of the National Healthcare for the Homeless Council with support from the HRSA Office of Special Populations Health. This session is being recorded. This is a 1-hour presentation with the last 10 minutes reserved for Q&A. A selected number of questions will be answered at the end of the presentation during the Q&A session. These are our presenters for today, and we'll do a brief overview of today's presentation. Our first presenter will give an overview of motivational interviewing, including the stages of change and components of motivational interviewing, followed by our second presenter, who will give an example of motivational interviewing in outreach. Our first presenter today is Kevin Kelly, LFMT, who is the Clinical Director of the Integrated Treatment Program for Co-Occurring Disorders at Homeless Healthcare Los Angeles. He was recently named Clinical Program Supervisor at Comprehensive Neurobehavioral Specialists. He received his Master's of Marriage and Family Therapy from the University of Southern California. Kelly is also an alumnus of the Southern California Council, where he counseled individuals, couples, and families. He worked as a therapist at West Coast Counseling Center, a preferred aftercare provider for persons exiting high-end treatment programs. While there, he conducted group and individual psychotherapy for persons with substance and sexual addictions. Kevin?
Okay. So these are some of our learning objectives, but I want you to pay particular attention to the first one, the spirit of motivational interviewing. But you should also be able to define motivation, describe the stages of change, and discuss core motivational interviewing components. And hopefully you'll feel motivated to get some more training. So the gentlemen who invented motivational interviewing, Drs. Miller and Rolnick, describe it as a client-centered directive method for enhancing intrinsic motivation to change by exploring and resolving ambivalence. That's a lot of words. Don't worry about it. We're going to break it down later. The spirit of motivational interviewing, Dr. Miller describes as not a series of techniques for doing therapy, but instead is a way of being with patients. It's also known as helping people talk themselves into changing, although I think our friend in the mirror may be in the pre-contemplation stage of change. So it's further described as being collaborative. It's a partnership that honors a client's expertise and their perspectives. It's evocative. The resources and motivation are presumed to reside within the client. And it's empowering. It affirms the client's right and capacity for self-direction that facilitates informed choice. It creates a sense of hospitality or a safe place to look at your life. It honors everyone's story. Everyone has a story to tell. It's characterized by empathy, not sympathy. And once your relationship is sufficiently developed, entering the shadows, creating a safe place to explore areas that are never explored. 4 principles of motivational interviewing are express empathy, develop discrepancy, what I think is the sweet spot of this work, roll with resistance, and finally support self-efficacy. We'll take a closer look at each of those. So expressing empathy. Why? Because acceptance facilitates change. Skillful, reflective listening is fundamental to this work, and ambivalence is a normal part of the change process. Developing discrepancy. The client, rather than the clinician, should present the arguments for change. Change is motivated by perceived discrepancy between present behavior and important personal goals and values. In other words, people decide to change when they realize that the cost of remaining the same is greater than the cost of changing. Rolling with resistance. As I said, I believe this is the sweet spot of this work. Avoid arguing for change, because if you do that, you'll put your client in the position of arguing to stay the same. Resistance is not directly opposed. In fact, if you confront resistance, you'll create more resistance. New perspectives are offered, but not imposed. Client is the primary resource in finding answers and solutions. And here's the fun part of this. Resistance is a signal to respond differently. It's a cue to change what you're doing. Next, please. And finally, supporting self-efficacy. Belief in the possibility of change is an important motivator for your client. The client, not the counselor, is responsible for choosing and implementing change. And the provider's own belief in the person's ability to change becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. They know when you believe that they're capable of making change. So I promise we'd break down all those words a little bit. First of all, motivational interviewing, a client-centered directive method for enhancing intrinsic motivation to change by exploring and resolving ambivalence. Let's take a look at the word interviewing. It implies that this is something that happens between people, that you sit down in a collaborative manner together and take a look at what's going on in the client's life. Client-centered, if some of you have been trained in Rogerian therapy or client-centered therapy, you'll realize that this is largely a build-out, and at its heart, it is Rogerian-based. It's a here-and-now approach, genuine, accepting, and empathetic. It assumes the strengths reside within the client as well as the resources. It's goal-oriented. And this is very important. The client determines the focus and pace. It's an egalitarian therapeutic relationship, which means it's collaborative. And it honors freedom of choice. It just accepts the fact that your client's going to make their choices. The directive means serving to direct, indicate, or guide. If you've ever been on a wilderness adventure, you realize the value of having a guide. They may not tell you what vacation to take, but they can help prevent you from falling off the cliff. The method is a way of doing something in a systematic way, and it applies an orderly, logical arrangement, and it usually happens in steps. So what is motivation? Motivation is the tipping point for making change happen. It comes from both external factors and intrinsic factors. Motivation is the key to change. It's multidimensional. You can be at different levels of motivation in different areas of your life. It's dynamic. It fluctuates. It's influenced by social interactions and by the clinician's style. And it can be elicited and enhanced. Three critical components of motivation: ready, willing, and able. Sort of the three-legged stool of this work. So ready means it's a matter of priorities. It's a high priority for the client. They're willing, they regard it as important, and they have the confidence that they can actually make the change. So motivational interviewing works beautifully in concert with the trans-theoretical model of the stages of change that we've talked about already. You're probably familiar with it: pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, action, maintenance, termination. This is very important. Relapse is viewed as a loss of motivation and movement back down the spiral of change. It's expected, it's anticipated, and it's viewed as a learning opportunity. Pre-contemplation, the person does not consider the possibility for change. It usually shows up like problem. What problem? I don't have a problem. Contemplation, the person is ambivalent and considers change versus no change. Most of us are ambivalent about making change in every area of our life. It's a natural part of the process. In the preparation stage, the person considers various strategies for change. In the action stage, the person actually initiates change, puts the plan into place. And in the maintenance stage, they continue to live in the new way. So what do you do in each of these stages? So in the pre-contemplation stage, do raise doubt, explore the pros and cons of making change, increase the perception of risks and problems, and that's the process of helping to develop discrepancy, where the client is and where they want to be. Don't nag, push into action, give advice, cover or make excuses, and certainly do not give up. Contemplation stage, do provide empathy, explore ambivalence, the pros and cons, evoke the client's reasons to change. Strengthen hope and their confidence that they can make change. Don't take sides, push your personal views, and do not yet create an action plan. In the preparation stage, explore the client's options for change, help to set acceptable goals, develop an effective and achievable action steps. These goals are acceptable to the client, not to you. Don't push the client too fast or too hard or decide for the client which option to take. In the action stage, help build needed skills and coping strategies, assist with accessing resources, family and social support. Don't give up, and don't push the client to take on too much. And finally, the maintenance stage. Do maintain supportive contact with the client. Your job isn't done yet. Facilitate support for short and long-term change. Develop a relapse prevention support, so fire escape plan. Don't give up, and don't push the client too hard. Assumptions about change in motivational interviewing. The first, motivation is a state, not a trait. It can be changed and influenced. Ambivalence is normal, positive. Resistance happens. It's not a force to be overcome. It's a signal to change what you're doing. The other person is an ally, not an adversary. And finally, recovery, change, and growth are intrinsic to the human experience. Now, this issue of ambivalence, I want to but I don't want to, which we all feel. It's a natural phase in the process of change. Problems persist when people get stuck in ambivalence. However, it's a normal aspect of human nature. It's not pathological. And it is the key issue to resolve for change to occur. People often get stuck not because they fail to appreciate the downside of their situation, but because they feel at least two ways about it. Yeah, here's a cost-benefit balance. And just to repeat what I said earlier, people change when they realize that the cost of staying the same outweighs the cost of making a change. Resistance happens. It's not a force to be overcome. We want to roll with resistance. It's a signal to change what you're doing, and it's influenced by clinician responses. So traps to avoid, getting into a question-answer debate, taking sides, taking an expert stance, labeling people or behaviors, premature focus or pacing, trying to go too fast. You have to go at the client's pace, and blaming. So here's some tools of motivational interviewing, and it's characterized by the acronym OARS: open-ended questions, affirmations, reflective listening, and summaries. Again, the quote that we had earlier. So let's take a look at open-ended questions. Here are some examples. Can you tell me more about that situation? What have you noticed about your blank? Basically, as you probably already know, an open-ended question is one that can't be answered in one word. Affirmations. These are statements of recognition of a client's strengths. You build confidence in a client's ability to change, but they must be congruent and genuine. They'll know immediately if you're faking it. Reflective listening. Reflective listening is the key to this work, according to Drs. Miller and Rolnick. The best motivational advice we can give you is to listen carefully to your clients. They will tell you what has worked and what hasn't, what moved them forward and shifted them backward. Whenever you're in doubt about what to do, listen. So here's some levels of reflection. As simple as just repeating, rephrasing, and staying close to the content, but it's really not simple. If it's not done artfully, you'll hear your client ask you why you're just repeating everything they say. Amplified reflection includes paraphrasing, double-sided reflection, testing the meaning and what's going on below the surface. And then finally, feelings, emphasizing the emotional aspect of communication, and it is regarded to be the deepest level of reflection. Summarizing is a special form of reflective listening. It ensures clear communication. It's really useful at transitions in the conversation or if you need to change the subject. But you have to be concise. Very useful way to reflect ambivalence and accentuate change talk. So here are some techniques, some general practice guidelines for motivational interviewing. Talk less than your client does. Offer 2 or 3 reflections for every question you ask a client. Ask twice as many open-ended questions as closed questions. And finally, when listening empathetically, more than half of your reflections should go beyond simple reflection. Eliciting change statements. Highlight the disadvantages of the status quo. Highlight the advantages of change. And it's very important to express optimism about the possibility of change and underscore the client's intention to change. So here's some techniques for exploring willing. On using a scaling question on a scale of 1 to 10, how important is it now for you to change? Why did you give it a 3 and not a 4? What would have to happen to raise that score from a 3 to a 4? How can I help you with that? Same approach for exploring confidence, the able. Strengthening commitment to change. Now, this is a slow and careful process. It's done by recognizing the client's signs of readiness, helping them be aware of hazards, obstacles to making change, triggers for relapse. Summarizing is a useful way to consolidate their readiness to change. Ask key questions. Create space. But don't be an investigator. Be genuinely curious. Give information and advice. And negotiate an acceptable change plan at the client's pace. So giving advice, it's always a temptation. Because, I don't know about you, I often feel I have the answer to my client's problems. But it's very important to ask permission to discuss these concerns. Make sure that you state your concerns non-judgmentally. Affirm that the decision is the client's to make, which is just accepting reality. They're going to make their choices, and they're going to act on their choices. Genuinely inquire what the client thinks. Genuinely help them evaluate their options. And finally, provide affirmations and hope. And taking my own suggestion, I'll ask if I can give some advice. When in doubt, listen. Here are a few references. The most important I'd like to highlight for you are Drs. Miller and Rolnick's book, Motivational Interviewing, Preparing People to Change, and the website, motivationalinterview.org. They're both rich and very useful resources. Thanks.
Thank you, Kevin. Our next presenter is John Prochaska, who's been an outreach worker with Catholic Charities Housing First program since 2005. He helps long-term users of Secure Waiting Space, a shelter for 251 homeless adult men, to find and maintain housing. Previously, he worked on housing policy issues at HUD, with homeless families at the Amherst Wilder Foundation, and on shelter and development issues at Metro-wide engagement on shelter and housing. John?
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for letting me participate. I hope you can all hear me well. I have a short slide presentation that I'd like to do for you all today. I'm not going to cover any motivational interviewing skills because Kevin already did a great job of doing that, but rather I'm going to try to talk about how motivational interviewing can be useful in a shelter in-reach or in an outreach setting. I'd like to first of all acknowledge that I'm not an expert in motivational interviewing. In fact, I struggle to use it and to integrate it into my work every day. I think it's easy to say that motivational interviewing is a way of being with clients rather than a technique, but that doesn't make it easy to be, in quotation marks, the motivational interviewing that you wish to see. So I, like many of you perhaps, am committed to just trying my best to integrate motivational interviewing into my life and my work. So first I'd like to tell you a little bit about the workplace that I have and the challenges of my job. Then I'm going to go into I'll show you some pictures. We'll start with photos. How about that? This is the Secure Waiting Space, the place where I am employed, and this is, like Victoria said, it's an adult overnight shelter for 251 men. It's located in Minneapolis on the edge of downtown. We have a free shelter for 125 men and a pay-for-stay program for 126 men. We opened in 1996, and we have very, very low barriers. We take pretty much anybody, as long as they can be respectful of each other and of the staff in the building, and there's no length of stay restrictions, so we have some guests who've been with us for a long time, and that is my goal, is to help some of those folks find and maintain housing, get connected to health care, connect to income supports that they might be eligible for, deal with immigration issues and other personal things that folks want to work on. So I've been doing that since 2005, like Victoria said. The goals that we have are not easy ones to reach, and I want to talk a little bit about that. We have lots of long-term homeless folks, people who've been homeless for very long periods of time, who struggle with chemical dependency and mental health issues, chronic addiction, health problems that go on, a lack of resources, extreme poverty. Housing in Minneapolis that is affordable to people is scarce, and our shelter and many of the other shelters in town have very limited staff to deal with the large number of people that we have. So I wanted to put up a photo here of one of the guys that is an example of one of my clients. This is Bill. He's, as you can see, someone who uses a walker. He was in our shelter for about 10 years with his chronic health conditions, chemical dependency issues, mental health issues. Somebody who it was really a struggle to try to connect with and try to help him to talk himself into leaving the shelter. But eventually we succeeded in doing so, and I'm happy to say that he is no longer in our shelter. He was able to obtain housing and stayed there until he passed away a few years ago. My focus in my work has always been on the top users of shelter. When I worked with families, I worked with the 30 families in my county that were the highest users of shelter, and now my primary focus is on the top couple people in our adult shelter. The reason for that is that they consume a huge part of the shelter resource. In fact, our top 10 individual shelter users use about as much shelter as our bottom 2,000 people do in the course of an average year. But slow, steady progress. At least I have the benefit of being able to work indoors with people who come in every night and are predictable in their patterns, and many of you, I imagine, are working with folks who are outdoors, and that presents a whole set of other challenges. So I'm going to show you some pictures from street outreach and talk about some of those challenges. We have, when we do street outreach, to overcome the suspicion that many folks who are campers or outdoor unsheltered folks have of people who are out there to try to help them. They have been, I'll say, helped to death, in quotation marks, and many of them just want to be left alone. They have deliberately avoided social services, and the situations that they live in are really unpredictable. There's places where we have very little of that control that makes our work in a shelter a little bit easier. We have to deal with people who are in very difficult personal situations, as well as in very difficult physical environments. So here's a picture. The last picture was under the I-94 freeway bridge, and this is a client of mine, Daryl. He's headed to his camp underneath probably an 8-lane freeway bypass. And when you talk about a difficult physical environment that people live in, it's difficult sometimes when we do outreach just to be heard. And I don't mean only in a literal sense, although when you're underneath the freeway bridge, you know it's a noisy place, or when you're outside, you know, in a park, sometimes there's a lot of noise. So we have the literal struggle to be heard, but we also have the metaphorical struggle to be heard over the noise in people's lives, in unsheltered people and in sheltered people's lives. The noise of mental health issues, of intoxication, of fear, of loss, of depression. We struggle to try to connect with people when all we have to offer may be a blanket or a bottle of water or an offer of assistance down the line, or maybe just, you know, here's a telephone, make a call if you need to, kind of thing. I think this is a picture here of a camp in St. Paul, Minnesota. This is occupied by some gentlemen who were undocumented immigrants from Mexico, and I think about what I had to offer those guys was conversation, bottle of water, a blanket. But they were really concerned about police and immigration officials and all sorts of stuff that even the average unsheltered homeless person isn't concerned about. So some of the real challenges that we have. include also a deep perceptual divide between ourselves and the people that we work with. And I'm showing you a picture right now of a camp in St. Paul, Minnesota, near where my home is. And this gentleman, Alan, when I first met him, I went out to do a survey of folks who are experiencing homelessness. We do it every 3 years. And I said, hey, I'd like to ask you a couple questions from this survey for homeless people. And he said, well, I'd love to answer your questions, but I'm not homeless because I live right here. And that was an example for me of the enormous perceptual divide that sometimes exists between myself as a helping professional and the people that I try to serve, who may or may not perceive that they are in need of help at all. So finally, no matter where we practice or with whom, we have one more great struggle, and that is how to address the way that people perceive us. And I'm going to put up a kind of a funny picture. I think sometimes that we are perceived like this slick car salesman sort of gentleman because people wonder what our motivations are. They wonder, are we really there to help, or are we really there to try to sell them a clunker? Are we trying to get them into things that they might not be ready for? Are we trying to sell, in quotation marks, people things that they aren't really ready to buy? And Kevin talked about developing motivation in people and getting them to be ready, willing, and able to move into housing or to accept services, to make really significant changes in their lives and to basically adopt a new way of living. I always tell my clients, if you start working with me, you're going to have to go to a lot of appointments, and that's, it's good sometimes that they go to these appointments and see doctors and dentists and therapists that they maybe haven't connected with before, but it is a real shift in their lifestyle. People may not want to enter into a treatment plan or a program. They may not want to have a case manager, in quotation marks. One of my clients told me once that a case manager was just someone who managed to get on his case once in a while, so I stopped calling myself a case manager then, and now I'm an outreach worker because you can't do much with that. Some folks may not be comfortable with the idea of having a disability, even though a disability can be the thing that gets them into housing or gets them the income that they need or the services that they're eligible for. In any event, all of these things represent change for the person that we're working with, and change is very difficult. We probably all pride ourselves on being discerning consumers, and the people that we work with are too. They make decisions about what kind of change they want to invite into their life and what kind they don't want to or might not be ready to invite into their lives. So fortunately, I think there is a way of being with people that can help us overcome some of these challenges, and that is motivational interviewing. As Kevin has described, it is a way of being with people rather than a set of techniques. But why I think motivational interviewing is wonderful is that it takes away the pressure to sell anything to our clients. We don't have to convince people. We just have to offer ourselves up to them in a supporting role and to help them, like Kevin said, talk themselves into the change that they want. Motivational interviewing is wonderful because it can be used as effectively in brief encounters with people as in in-depth conversations or in a more counseling role. I know that in my work it's really difficult to find more than a minute or two to talk to people before you have to move on to something else. But when I do get a chance to sit down with people and really have a deep conversation, I find that motivational interviewing techniques or strategies or ideas inform my work just as much then as in those brief encounters. Motivational interviewing is wonderful because it is client-centered. We are not the experts. The client is the expert, and we are letting them direct us in ways that into things that they would like to change. Takes the pressure off of us, and it allows us to build relationships with our clients. And those relationships are really the place where change happens. When trust is built and people are willing to share their deepest, darkest stuff with you, that's where they really can start to talk about the kind of change that they want to make in their lives. So motivational interviewing is difficult too, and like I said at the beginning of my presentation, I'm not an expert and I struggle with motivational interviewing when I try to do it. I think we all know that we are fixers. Many of us, we want to fix problems in people's lives. We have seen what has worked well for our other clients. We know that great things can happen when people are willing to see a doctor, move into an apartment, apply for benefits. And we know that people are capable of change because we've seen it so many times. And it can be frustrating when someone is hesitant or ambivalent about change, and we just know if they would just do this one thing that everything would be better for them, or some things would be better, or some things could be better for them. We have expectations of ourselves. We want to see ourselves as helping people, and in order to see yourself that way, you actually have to help people change once in a while, and it can be frustrating when people aren't ready. And sometimes we have to deal with the reality that other people have expectations of us. I know that if I went to work for a year and all I did was practice my reflective listening techniques and didn't move anybody into housing, my boss would be pretty upset with me. So there are these external expectations that are placed on us that our clients will be changing at least frequently enough that we can keep track of that and show that we're accomplishing something. Motivational interviewing is also challenging for those of us who are impatient people because it really is all about patience. And if you, I think it's probably the single biggest skill that you have to be successful as an outreach worker or an in-reach worker is to have just abiding, deep sense of patience with people in the process of change. It's really hard to turn off that writing reflex, too, that Kevin talked about, the writing instinct that we have to try to just tell people what they need to do. I have a case study that I wanted to talk briefly about, and I think that Victoria is putting this up on the webpage so that you can look at it after the webinar is over, but I typed up a conversation. I kind of summarized the conversation that I had with a client of mine named Richard, who is an elderly long-term shelter user. He's a Vietnam veteran, a gentleman who lives with schizophrenia, but doesn't agree with that diagnosis. He doesn't acknowledge that he has any mental health issues. And I helped him move into an apartment a couple of years ago, and he has occasionally decided that that apartment wasn't the place for him to live, and he decided to return to the shelter, and I have had to sort of help him redirect his energies and move back into that apartment and out of the shelter. It's probably been 2 or 3 times now that we've done this, but he's very paranoid, has a lot of fears about the other people in his building, a lot of concerns about what people are saying about him and thinking about him, and whether where he lives is a good place or a bad place, and anyway, I used reflection and summarizing statements and affirmations, open questions in my conversations with Richard, especially the last time he was in shelter, to try to get him talking about some of the things that were bothering him, some of the things that he felt like had happened that had led him to leave his apartment behind and move back into the shelter. I also used informing statements and empathy and tried to develop some of the discrepancies between what Richard was saying and what he was doing. Some of the things that he said and did weren't necessarily in sync with each other, and I tried to help him work through those things, and eventually managed, through using motivational interviewing, to manage to help him talk himself back into going home, which is where he remains today. Richard is happily housed, or at least as happily as he'll ever be, I think, housed in his apartment, and I haven't seen him back in shelter. So I would encourage you to just take a look through this brief summary that I prepared. It is, like I said, it is sort of unnatural to try to boil down 2 or 3 hours worth of conversation into a 1-page or 2-page little document, but I hope it gives you a sense of how it can work for people. I want to talk finally, before I end, about how motivational interviewing can become part of your personal mission statement as an outreach worker or an in-reach worker or a case manager or helping professional. I think that for me, I have a personal goal for my work, and motivational interviewing is entirely consistent with it, but it doesn't make it any easier. I think that being in, quotes, motivational interviewing is still a real challenge. But my personal mission statement is that I want to build and sustain client-centered relationships that are based on trust, in which I help my clients achieve their goals over time. And you don't have to come up with anything quite like this, but I would encourage you to think about what motivates you in your work. What is it that you're trying to accomplish with people, and how does motivational interviewing fit into that? Is it consistent with your mission statement? Is motivational interviewing part of what you're trying to do? Is motivational interviewing part of the mission of the organization that you work for? Do you feel like your employer or your workplace supports motivational interviewing as a means of working with people or of involving people in the process of their own change? So that's a challenge to you to consider that. I would like to end with putting up my contact information. Anybody who has questions or comments or just wants to talk about particularly challenging clients that they're working with, I love that kind of stuff, so please feel free to write me an email or to give me a call anytime. I love talking with other people who do this work. So thank you again for letting me be a part of the webinar today.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Kevin, for your earlier presentation. We'll begin our Q&A session now. I have one question from Alicia Hernandez, and she said that both speakers emphasized how important it is to let the client guide the pace. What is your advice? We have a very short time limit, like 10 or 15 minutes, on how to at least do something during that time. We'll start with Kevin, and then I'd actually like John to weigh in on this one as well. Kevin?
First of all, from a research perspective, there's good, clear research that shows that one session of motivational interviewing has an impact. If you are familiar with the SPERT program, you can review that research. But honestly, listen, honor their choice, and be curious about what they want to do with their life. If you start there, you've already provided more than what most of our clients have received.
Thank you, Kevin. John, I'd like you to weigh in on this one as well. Thanks, John.
Great question. Thanks, Alicia. I guess I'm kind of a practically oriented person, and I know that when I have limited time with someone, I like to emphasize with them or remind them that change takes time, and that if they are patient, that things kind of work out. And I remind people that if you are going to climb from the bottom of a set of steps to the top, you don't do it by jumping. So you have to figure what is going to be the next step that you put your foot on. And I like to try to leave conversations with people with at least one concrete thing that they may do, or that I may do with them or for them, or that I might help them with. If I walk away from a conversation with someone and I feel like I have something to do, or that they have something to do, even if that something to do is just, hey, why don't you think about this a little bit and get back to me the next time you see me and let me know what you thought about it. I feel like that's successful. I have learned not to set big grand goals for myself in this work, and I think surviving and doing a good job here it means celebrating the little things that people do. And if you can get someone to just say, hey, I'll think about it, that's awesome.
Thank you, John. Our next question is from Tiffany Russell. My organization is based on a harm reduction model. What is an appropriate way to set boundaries in public space in view of other clients, considering the varying mental health states that staff is aware of between clients? John, would you like to weigh in on this one, please?
I think I understand the question to be just how do you do this when there are people watching, listening, paying attention to what you do. That is extremely difficult, and I know that when things tend to get real personal with people, that makes me uncomfortable having an audience, and I do try to pull people off of the shelter floor into a little space, or step outside, maybe they have a cigarette or something while we talk. I do like to try to create a little privacy. Sometimes that's impossible, either because the person's not interested in moving, or because they have a group of friends who are there who are kind of, acting like the chorus almost in a play, trying to convince somebody to do something or not to do something. And that really does complicate our practice. I know many times I have gone out and I feel like I'm sort of trying to do motivational interviewing with 5 people at a time. It's very difficult, and I would just encourage you, when you are working with somebody, if you can get them away, even for a minute, it really matters to give them that space. Sorry if that's kind of a broad response to the question.
Thank you, John. Our next question is, do you use these techniques with someone who is intoxicated, perhaps mildly, but clearly altered? What do you do when this is a consistent state for the client at this point? Kevin, would you like to weigh in on this one, please?
Sure. The first and most important principle in both harm reduction and motivational interviewing is a phrase that we're all familiar with: meet the client where they are. So if they're intoxicated but able to participate, then continue. Meet them where they are. If they're too altered, then I would come back another time.
Great. Thank you, Kevin. We have another question for John. John, when dealing with motivational interview, how can a client who has no motivation use this concept?
I think I understood the question. Does motivational interviewing have any application to a client who may not have any motivation? Maybe I'm misstating that, but I think everybody, is at some process, is at some stage in the process of change. And remember, the first stage is, I think, pre-contemplation, right? Before the person's even willing to think about it. Maybe your role there is to just help the person put something on their mental agenda and be willing to think about it a little bit. Maybe that's just fine. Somebody who doesn't have motivation to do the thing that you want them to do, that kind of resistance may be something that you have to consider and just roll with, like Kevin was describing, rolling with resistance. Yeah, I don't know if I'm answering that well, but yeah, sometimes you just need to focus on building the relationship with the person before you need to try to figure out what they're motivated to do.
Thank you, John. Kevin has a few comments to add on this one as well.
Yeah, I want to piggyback just on the last part of John's response, which is that Drs. Miller and Rolnick in their books have a very powerful statement, I think, which is clients are not unmotivated. They're just motivated to continue in behaviors that we don't find acceptable. So that if you accept that they're actually motivated to do what they're doing and just not what you want them to, it helps you to meet them where they are and to try to begin the process of creating discrepancy.
Great. Thank you, Kevin. I believe that is our last question. I would like to thank you for joining this webinar production, Motivational Interviewing, an overview and application and outreach produced by the National Healthcare for the Homeless Council. This webinar will be archived on our website at www.nhchc.org within 72 hours. I've also put up an information slide about other upcoming webinars, how to join the National Healthcare for the Homeless Council, either as an individual member or as an organizational member. And I'd also like to point you to one of our upcoming events. On our website, you can find that on our homepage at www.nhchc.org. You can register for our regional training in Detroit, Michigan on September 19th and 20th. We thank you for your attendance today, and this meeting will now be closed.